In this class, I'd like to explore two related problems. One is, where are there weaknesses intrinsic in our logic model? And then what problems do we see in implementing the logic model when we actually bring it out into the real world? Let me begin with weaknesses. I'm showing you here a very basic logic model, and I'd just like you to take a look at the relationship between outputs and outcomes. You'll see that the outcomes here are an 80% reduction in the homeless population within 5 years and a net reduction in taxpayer expenditures on homeless services. Take a look at the outputs. We're providing services to reduce substance abuse, job training, mental health service, transportation voucher program, and a few other services. The question I'd like for us to ask ourselves is there a plausible causal relationship between the outputs we're describing and the outcomes? Would these various services be likely to significantly reduce homelessness or to reduce the burden on taxpayers? The advantage of asking this question in a logic model is it shows up weaknesses. If the answer isn't obvious that one thing would lead to another, then you have to get more information, or perhaps it turns out, as I think in this case, that the outputs are never going to lead to the outcomes and that you really need to create a different strategy in order to achieve the outcomes you wish to achieve. So why bother? Why take the trouble to look for problems in the logic model? Well, in some ways I've answered the question already. If the logic model is flawed, which often means that the theory of change underlying the logic model is flawed, then it's simply not going to work. You're going to invest money and resources in a project that's just not going to reach the outcome you intend. There are several reasons to be especially self-critical about your own logic models and the theories of change underlying them. One has to do with overconfidence. The other has to do with a phenomenon called the planning fallacy. The best, or if you like, the worst story of overconfidence is the Titanic, building and then sailing a ship which people thought was absolutely invulnerable. And of course, we know what happened there. Logic models are particularly vulnerable to what's called the planning fallacy, that when you make a set of plans, you tend to look at how they're going to come out the way you want, rather than seeing ways in which they may not. A great example of the planning fallacy is the Big Dig in Boston, a project building a tunnel under the bay to the airport and bridges, which came in, I think, 10 years late and many times over budget. The engineers and architects who planned the Big Dig and built it were so sure that their plans were right that they never saw the various ways in which it might not succeed on time or on budget. In industry, there's a time-honored way of checking whether a complex industrial process will work, and in particular checking where it won't work. It's sometimes called a fault tree. So for example, if you have a nuclear reactor where, of course, the dangers of a fault are very severe, what you look for is every point in the process where something might fail. And that will allow you to build in redundancies where necessary or to build in special monitoring equipment. As I said at the very beginning of this class, social change is as complicated as flying a plane. It's as complicated as any industrial process. So you should do a fault tree with respect to your own plans for social change and see where they can fail in order to try to shore up where there are problems. So what might go wrong with a logic model? Let me put it in terms of questions we should ask about it. Will the homeless people we approach be amenable to intervention? Will we be able to provide services that make any difference in the lives of homeless people? And will whatever we do in terms of the lives of the homeless people result in protecting the safety and security of residents of the neighborhood? Now let's take another look at the logic model for permanent supportive housing and ask questions about its potential weaknesses. The first question is the same as we asked before, which is, will the people we approach on the street be amenable to permanent supportive housing? But there are other questions as well. Will we be able to find the units at a cost that we can afford in which to put the homeless? And will we be able to provide services to them that will maintain their stability in housing? And finally, the logic model for preventing homelessness and some of the questions we might ask about that logic model. For example, we mentioned a number of a number of risk factors that we thought would predict homelessness. But are they actually good predictors of the likelihood that somebody will become homeless? And will we be able to identify individuals who have those characteristics? And then finally, even if we can identify them, can we provide the services that are likely to keep them from being evicted?